Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind howled through the Medicine Bow Mountains as Wyatt Hargrove dragged a half-broke Mustang through the snow-dusted pass, reins burning in his gloved hands. He had not meant to stop in the small mining town of Anston Ridge, but the storm had other plans. What he found instead was a woman standing alone on a porch, arms crossed tight over her chest, staring at the world like it had wronged her, and she meant to return the favor. Her name was Willa Vexley. No one spoke to her. Not the blacksmith. Not the preacher's wife. Not even the school children, who whispered and pointed when she passed. Wyatt saw it all from the saloon window over a bowl of stew when she came to leave half a loaf of bread for the widow 2 doors down, then walked home without saying a word. She ain't right, the barkeep muttered, pouring Wyatt a second coffee. Folks say she's cursed. Husband's dead. Father drank himself to death. Brother vanished. Everything she touches turns to ash. Wyatt looked back out the window. Willa disappeared into the falling snow, her coat too thin for the cold. He stood. She got a name? Willa. Willa Vexley. Wyatt nodded once, pulled his coat on, and left without finishing his stew. Willa's cabin sat quiet at the edge of town, near the tree line, smoke barely curling from the chimney. The front gate hung crooked. No flowers grew in the planters. But the fences were mended, the porch swept, the steps free of ice. She kept what she had in order. She did not flinch when he knocked. Just opened the door with a flat stare and a shotgun resting against her hip. "You're lost," she said. "Not anymore," Wyatt replied. She didn't blink. "What do you want?" "Just to talk." "No one just talks to me. I ain't no one." That made her pause. She studied him like she was waiting for the cruel part to show. When it did not come, she stepped back, slow but certain. "Fire's lit. Close the door behind you." He did. She poured coffee into 2 mismatched tin mugs and handed him one without ceremony. Her hands were scraped and red from the cold. There were no rings on her fingers, no photographs on her shelves, just stacks of neatly folded quilts and a single worn rocking chair near the hearth. "You passing through?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Guess I am now," Wyatt said. "Why stop here?" He shrugged. "Storm forced my hand." Willa looked at him over the rim of her mug. "Storm forces a lot of things." He let the quiet sit for a moment, then asked, "You always this friendly?" She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "You sure you want to be seen here?" He sipped his coffee. "I do not care what people think. They all say I am cursed." "Are you?" "No," she said quietly. "Just unlucky." Wyatt nodded. "I have known unlucky. It does not scare me." That was the first time she looked him full in the face. Her eyes were pale gray, like river ice. There was something in them that made his chest ache, not fear, not sadness, but the weight of someone who had carried too much alone for too long. 2 days passed before he saw her again. He had taken work at the livery, helping the owner repair tack and shoe horses. She walked past in the early morning, a basket of dried herbs hanging from her arm. Wyatt stepped out onto the stoop. "Willa." She stopped, but did not turn. "You left your gloves at the cabin," he said, holding them out. She turned slowly. Her eyes softened a little. "I did not think you would notice. I notice everything about you." That stopped her cold. For a long second, she just stared. Then, without a word, she walked over and took the gloves from his hand. Her fingers brushed his. It was nothing, and it was everything. By the end of the week, Wyatt made excuses to walk past her place. Once with a saddle to mend. Once with a bag of flour he claimed he had no use for. Each time, she met him at the door. Each time, she let him stay a little longer. "You keep coming back," she said one night, voice quiet as the snow falling outside. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You keep letting me." She stood by the hearth, the firelight painting her face in gold. "They all think I am unlovable." He stepped closer. "They are wrong." She shook her head. "You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying." "Why me?" "Because when I look at you, I see someone who never gave up. Someone with more fight than anyone I have ever met. And because I want to be the man who helps you carry the rest." Willa's breath caught. She turned away, hiding her face. He stepped behind her and laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "You are not cursed, Willa. You are just tired." She leaned back into his hand, just a little. The next day, everything changed. A boy no older than 8 came running into the livery, his face red, hair wild. "Miss Vexley," he cried. "She is in trouble." Wyatt was in the saddle before the boy finished. He reached the cabin in minutes. The door was open, the table overturned. Inside, Willa stood with a broken chair leg in one hand, blood on her sleeve. A man lay groaning near the hearth. "Came looking for silver," she said, voice low. "Thought I was an easy mark." Wyatt stepped over the man and pulled Willa into his arms. "You are safe now." She did not resist, just pressed her face into his coat. "I thought I could handle it," she whispered. "You do not have to handle anything alone anymore." That night, he stayed. Sat beside her on the porch as the stars came out one by one. She leaned into his shoulder, warm and quiet. "You still sure?" she asked. Wyatt turned to her, brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Willa, they can all call you what they want. But you are not unlovable. You are all I will ever love." Her breath hitched. Then she kissed him, and it felt like the beginning of something true. The first real thaw came in late March, when the snow pulled back from the edges of the ridge and the water in the creek began to murmur again. Willa stood at the edge of her garden plot, boots sunk in mud, staring down at the beds where last year's root vegetables had withered under frost. She held a coil of twine in one hand and a length of willow pole in the other, dirt already under her fingernails. Behind her, Wyatt eased out of the barn, brushing sawdust from his coat. "You got plans for those sticks, or just threatening the ground with them?" She didn't turn. "You ever built a pea trellis?" "Built worse. Let me help." She passed him the twine, and together they drove the poles into the thawing earth, their hands brushing as they worked. The silence between them had shifted since that night, no longer thick with unsaid things, but easy, familiar. He tied the knots tightly, twice around, and once more for good measure. Willa stepped back, brushing her palms on her apron. "You tie like a cavalry scout." Served under Colonel Miles. 1877 through spring of 78. Her eyes flicked to his. "You saw the Tongue River then?" "I did." She didn't ask more. He didn't offer. Instead, she bent to gather the extra twine, tucking it into her basket beside a jar of ash for the soil. Later, over a supper of boiled beans and cornbread, Willa sat across from him, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "You planning to leave when the pass clears?" He set his spoon down carefully. "Was thinking I'd stay through planting. Maybe longer." Her gaze dropped to her hands, fingers curled around the edge of her bowl. "Folks still won't speak to me. They speak to me. That'll start to matter more." She looked up slow. "You think so?" "I know so." She didn't smile, but something eased in the corners of her mouth. That night, he slept in the lean-to beside the cabin, a bedroll spread over cedar boughs and his saddle for a pillow. In the dark, he listened to the wind shift through the pines, the sound of her footsteps across the floorboards above him, soft and unhurried. By mid-April, the townsfolk began to notice. When Wyatt brought 2 sacks of oats from the mill, the storekeep asked if he'd be delivering them to the Vexley place. Wyatt only said, "That's right," and waited until the man nodded, uneasy but silent. Willa noticed the change, too. She didn't speak of it outright, but once, while they planted early lettuce, she said, "You've got a way of making people reconsider things without saying much." He ran a gloved hand through the dirt. "Words aren't what change minds. Actions are." That evening, she handed him a bundle of dried yarrow wrapped tight in muslin. "For your shoulder," she said simply, nodding to the old scar he stretched every morning. "Steep it in hot water, then press." He took it carefully. "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me," she said, folding her arms. "You've earned a place here." The stillness that followed wasn't awkward. It felt like something settling into its rightful shape. One morning, as the sun climbed over the ridge and the hens scratched near the coop, Willa stepped out with her hair braided back and a shawl folded over her shoulders. She found Wyatt at the edge of the field, mending the fence where the winter winds had splintered it. She leaned on the post beside him. "I've been thinking of building a smokehouse." He wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Best start with cedar. I'll mark a few trunks near the creek." She hesitated. "It's more than I can manage alone." He met her eyes. "You're not alone." She looked away, but her voice was steady. "I know." They spent the next days marking trees, cutting planks, and digging the foundation. Wyatt showed her how to notch the beams to fit without nails, how to stack stone for a firebox that would draw clean. Willa moved with quiet confidence, sleeves rolled, hair pinned, eyes sharp. He watched her work, not with awe, but with a kind of quiet pride. One night, after the last beam had been hoisted into place, they stood before the frame, dusk painting the sky in long violet strokes. She reached out and laid her hand atop his. "I never thought I'd build something with someone again." He turned to her. "Then let's keep building." She didn't reply with words. She stepped in, rested her forehead against his chest, and let herself be still in his arms. In that moment, surrounded by sawdust and smoke and soft spring air, it was clear whatever had been broken in her had begun, at last, to mend. By early May, the air carried the scent of thawed pine and damp soil, and the mountains held onto the last of their snow like a secret. Willa stood at the edge of the smokehouse they'd finished 3 days prior, tying her apron behind her back as Wyatt opened the firebox. Thin tendrils of hickory smoke began to rise, curling into the morning light. Inside, slabs of venison hung from iron hooks, the first of the season's work. "You cut that meat straight," she said, watching the smoke turn blue. "I can tell." Wyatt tipped his hat back. "You always notice the details." She picked up a split log from the pile and added it to the fire. "That's how you keep things from falling apart." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into the canvas satchel beside the firewood and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "Got something from Cheyenne," he said, handing it to her. She took it carefully, reading the letter in silence. After a while, she folded it again, slower this time, and tucked it into her apron pocket. "From Mr. Lester," she said. "He wants to buy the ridge behind the orchard. Says there's shale in the hills. Are you thinking of selling?" "No," she said. "That land's never been for sale. Not when Pa was alive." "Not now." Wyatt nodded, rubbing calloused fingers together. "He'll ask again. Let him." She turned back toward the cabin, but stopped halfway. "You ever had someone try and take something from you because they thought it was easier than earning it?" He met her gaze. "Too many times to count." She held his eyes a beat longer, then walked inside without a word. That evening, a light rain fell, soft and steady, pattering against the roof as they sat at the table. Willa was sewing a patch to the elbow of a work shirt. Wyatt was oiling the blade of his hunting knife, the lantern throwing their shadows long across the walls. "Your stitching's cleaner than mine," he said, watching her fingers move. "I spent more years with a needle than I'd like." "You learn where the thread ought to go. You learn that with people too?" She set the shirt down, resting her hands in her lap. "Sometimes, but people pull loose more often." He leaned back in his chair. "You think I'll pull loose?" She shook her head. "No, that's not in you." The rain picked up, drumming harder now. She stood, crossed to the window, and looked out over the pasture where the horses stood under the lean-to. "Clara wrote me," she said, voice low. "Sent it care of the general store." Wyatt looked up. "Your cousin?" "Yes. Haven't heard from her since the winter Pa died. She's married now, lives outside Laramie. Wants me to visit." He waited. "She says she's sorry for what she once said. That folks in town were cruel, and she was trying to stay on the right side of them." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Willa said. "I don't feel anger anymore. Just distance. Like I'm remembering someone else's life." She turned back to him slowly. "You've never asked me what happened with my brother. I figured you'd speak on it when you were ready." She nodded once. "He left before the war ended. Joined a wagon company headed west. Said he'd send for us once he struck gold or built a house. We never heard again. I was 16. Wyatt stood and walked to her. "That must have left a hollow." "I filled it," she said, piece by piece." He reached out and gently took her hand. "You don't have to carry any of it alone now." She looked down at their joined hands, rough and weathered both. Then she looked up. "I'm not used to being chosen. Not without someone expecting something back." "I expect something," he said. She tensed. "I expect you to wake up beside me every morning," he said. "To laugh when I burn the biscuits. To tell me when I'm wrong. To build a life with me that no one else gets to touch." Her throat worked, but she said nothing. She stepped closer, pressed her forehead to his chest, and exhaled. "You mean it. Every word." That night, they lay beside each other in the loft, the wind quiet and the fire banked low. She didn't speak as he pulled the quilt over them, but her hand found his beneath the covers, fingers twining tight. Outside, the rain softened to mist and the mountains stood tall and still, keeper of what had come before and what would come next. The calves came early that spring, 2 weeks ahead of when Wyatt had figured they'd drop. He found the first one before dawn, slick and shivering in the grass just outside the fence line. The sky was still dark enough that the stars hadn't faded, and his breath curled in the cold as he wrapped the calf in burlap and carried it to the barn. Willa was already there, lantern hung from a nail, sleeves rolled past her elbows. She didn't startle when he stepped through the door, just pointed with her chin toward the straw bed she'd laid out near the stove box. "Put him there. I'll get the molasses." Wyatt settled the calf down and stripped off the wet cloth. Willa returned with a tin cup and a rag-wrapped bottle. She knelt beside the animal, dipped her fingers in the warm mix, and coaxed the weak mouth open. "Strong legs, but he's cold clear through." Her voice was steady. "We'll keep him near the stove till sunup." Wyatt handed her a dry towel. "You were already here." "I heard the mare pacing." She didn't look up. Didn't feel right to wait. He crouched beside her, watching the calf's ears twitch. "You've got away with things that can't speak for themselves." She gave a small nod, then leaned back on her heels. "Most folks don't listen unless something's loud or polished. Doesn't mean the quiet don't matter." Wyatt studied her in the dim light. The curve of her jaw, the crease between her brows, the quiet focus in her eyes. "You ever think on what else you'd have done if life had been kinder?" She didn't answer right away. Her hand moved over the calf's back, slow and careful. "I used to dream of teaching. Letters, numbers, how to read maps and chart stars. Pa taught me all that when I was little. Said knowing the shape of the world helped you hold your place in it." "You still could," Wyatt said. "Not here," she said simply. "But maybe. Somewhere close." He watched her face as she said it. There was no bitterness, no longing for what was gone. Just the steady weight of someone shaping what was left into something worth keeping. By midday, the calf was steady on its feet, nosing at the hay with a twitch of its tail. Willa stood back, arms crossed loosely, face unreadable. "That's yours," Wyatt said, brushing his hands on his trousers. "You saw to it." She shook her head lightly. "We both did." Wyatt stepped closer. "Everything's been yours, or mine since I got here. Maybe it's time we start saying ours." Willa didn't answer, but she didn't step away either. That night, after the sun dipped behind the ridge and the meadow turned silver with moonlight, Willa climbed the stairs to the loft without her usual lamp. Wyatt was already settling under the quilt, the scent of cedar in the air from the kindling he'd split that morning. She eased under the covers beside him, her body warm from the climb, her voice low. "Do you ever miss moving?" she asked. "Going place to place, never staying long?" He shifted onto his side, facing her. "I used to think peace would feel like stillness. But it turns out it feels more like waking up beside someone who wants your name spoken soft." She was quiet for a long time. "I want to know all the things you don't say out loud." He reached for her hand under the quilt. "Then stay close to me, and you will." She pressed her forehead to his collarbone, breath slow against his skin. "If we marry," she whispered, "it will be the first time anyone's ever stood beside me without shame." "We'll marry," Wyatt said, voice thick. "And there won't be a soul alive who'll make you feel you have to lower your eyes again." Willa's fingers curled tight around his. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a hush. Inside, they lay tangled in one another, the quiet between them no longer a shield, but a vow. By June, the ridge bloomed in wild lupin and the grass grew thick enough to hide the fence rails. Willa stood in the doorway of the cabin with her hair pinned in a coil, watching Wyatt lead the mare along the edge of the orchard. He was checking the apple trees for blight, same as he'd done each morning that week. She didn't call to him, just watched him move, slow and sure, like the land had grown used to him. That evening, she brought in a basket of early rhubarb and set it on the table. Wyatt glanced at it and raised a brow. "You mean to poison me with that?" Willa rolled her eyes. "Only if you keep cutting the lower limbs off the apple trees. They'll bear short next year if you're not careful." He leaned back in his chair. "You're planning 5 seasons ahead now. I like knowing what'll be here when I'm 40. He didn't answer right off. Just looked at her in a way that made her pulse thrum low in her throat. Then he stood and crossed to her, resting a hand on the edge of the table. "I want to be here for all of them." Her mouth opened, but no words came. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a band of braided leather, worn smooth in the center where his thumb had passed over it again and again. He set it down on the table between them. My mother wove that when I left for the army. Said it was meant for the woman I'd build a home with. I kept it all this time." He lifted his eyes. "I want it to be yours." Willa stared at it, breath shallow. "You're not asking with flowers and a ring. I'm asking with land and work and the long haul. With every day I've got left." She lifted the band and turned it over in her hand. "Then you better be ready to live with someone who speaks her mind and wakes before sunrise." He smiled, the corners of his eyes warming. "That's the only kind I'd want." They were married on a warm Sunday beneath the cottonwoods, just past the creek bend. No preacher came. Willa said she didn't need a man with a collar to know what was true. Clara arrived from Laramie 2 days before, carrying a jar of peach preserves and enough apology in her eyes to fill the canyon. She stood beside Willa as she braided her hair that morning, quiet and careful. "I should have written sooner," Clara said. "I should have stood with you when it mattered." "You're here now," Willa said, without looking in the mirror. "That matters too." Wyatt wore his cleanest shirt and the coat he'd stitched new buttons onto by lantern light. Willa wore her mother's shawl and a skirt she'd let down herself, the hem brushing the tops of her boots. They spoke their promises with steady voices and hands clasped tight. There was no crowd, just Clara, the boy from the livery who'd started calling Willa ma'am, without flinching, and the wind moving through the cottonwood leaves like a song only the two of them could hear. Afterward, Wyatt walked her back to the cabin as the sun dropped low behind the ridge. The porch creaked under their steps. Inside, the fire was already warming the hearth. Willa hung the shawl over the back of the chair and turned. "I never thought I'd have this again. A home that felt like mine." Wyatt crossed the room and drew her into his arms. "It's not just yours anymore. It's ours." She rested her head against his chest. "You've given me something quiet, something steady. You gave it to me first," he said. Years passed. They planted more apple trees and a second row of beans. Wyatt built a new stall onto the barn, and Willa taught 2 neighbor girls their letters at the kitchen table each Wednesday. Clara visited every summer, and the boy from the livery grew into a man who helped Wyatt mend fences and split wood each fall. They never left Anston Ridge. They never had to. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with their knees touching, watching the sky change color. Willa kept her sewing basket beside her, and Wyatt always had something in his hands, a bit of leather to work, a pipe to tamp, a carving to finish. One night, when the first frost touched the grass and the fire crackled behind them, she reached for his hand. "You still glad you stayed?" He looked at her like he always did, without hesitation, without doubt. "I never once looked back." She leaned her head on his shoulder. He kissed her temple, and the quiet wrapped around them like a promise kept.